Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
The house smelled like cinnamon, expensive perfume, and secrets no one dared to say out loud. I hadn't been back in nearly 15 years, not since college, and yet somehow, everything looked exactly the same. Same beige walls, same glass figurines in the curio cabinet, same collection of floral plates mounted on the dining room wall like family heirlooms with no real value except what Grandma Evelyn told us they had. She ruled this house like a queen on a porcelain throne, high-necked blouses, red lipstick, and a voice that could cut through any room without ever rising above a whisper. And today, she was turning 80, and the family was gathered like obedient little servants to sing her praises and pretend we all liked each other. I wasn't there for the cake. I wasn't there for the roast chicken and mashed potatoes she insisted be served at exactly 4:30. I wasn't even there to hear my cousin Lydia pretend to be humble as Grandma gave her another backhanded compliment disguised as love. No, I was there to return something. A memory. A truth. A wound. I wasn't sure anymore which. When I walked in, the room quieted just a bit, the way it does when someone enters that doesn't quite belong anymore. My mother hugged me too tightly, her fingers trembling just slightly against my back. Uncle Daniel barely made eye contact. Lydia offered a tight smile, and her husband, some clean-cut, golf-shirted man I'd never met, looked at me like he wasn't sure if I was a second cousin or a caterer. Grandma sat in the living room like she was posing for a painting, wrapped in a blue silk shawl, holding a wine glass she hadn't touched. Her legs were crossed neatly. Her makeup was perfect. Her eyes, when they landed on me, didn't flicker. "Sarah," she said, dragging out the syllables like she was tasting something bitter and deciding whether or not to spit. "Well, you do look mature." There was a polite chuckle around the room, the kind that says, "Let's all pretend this is fine." I smiled, said hello, and kept my coat on. They did the cake thing an hour later. Lydia led the singing, her voice too sweet, her laughter too loud. I stood near the back, behind the armchair, watching. Grandma clapped, waved a hand dramatically, and said, "I don't want presents. I want blessings." And perhaps, she paused, her eyes sliding over to Lydia, a little appreciation for raising such an elegant generation. Then, as if the devil had whispered the line in her ear, she turned her head just so, looked Lydia up and down, and said it. At least one grandchild turned out elegant. Everyone laughed. Not wildly, just enough to show they got the joke. Lydia smiled and tucked her hair behind her ear like some damn commercial for shampoo. Uncle Daniel chuckled under his breath. My mother made that face she makes when she doesn't want to admit she's uncomfortable. And me? I just stood there. I didn't laugh. I didn't even smile. I reached into my purse, pulled out the small white envelope I'd had printed last week, and walked slowly through the room like I had all the time in the world. I stopped in front of Lydia, held it out to her with 2 fingers, and looked right into my grandmother's perfectly painted eyes. "Good thing she's elegant," I said, my voice calm, steady, almost pleasant. "She's gonna need it. In court." For a split second, the room didn't register what had happened. Lydia took the envelope out of reflex, still smiling, as if it were another birthday card or maybe a gift certificate to her favorite spa. Then her fingers felt the stiffness of the document inside. Her face changed, just slightly, like a crack across porcelain, and she opened it. The room tilted. Uncle Daniel straightened. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. And Grandma Evelyn's smile evaporated, clean off her face like fog from a mirror. "What the hell is this?" Lydia asked, her voice too loud, too sharp. I didn't answer. Not yet. Because the truth is, when you finally hand back the damage someone gifted you as a child, you want them to look at it for a while. You want them to hold it. Feel its weight. Wonder how the hell it's still alive. They all started talking at once. Uncle Daniel saying something about nonsense. My mother whispering my name like it was a prayer or a curse. Grandma trying to stand, but suddenly looking a little older than 80. And Lydia, she opened the papers fully, her breath hitching as her eyes scanned the legal summons, her perfectly manicured finger trembling as she read the words aloud. Petition for civil damages, dated back to, oh my God, I had waited over 20 years to see that reaction. 20 years since I told someone what he did. 20 years since she told me to shut up. 20 years of silence, therapy, rage, and finally, power. And now, they were all looking at me like I'd just thrown a hand grenade into their precious dinner party. Which, to be fair, I had. I turned to Grandma and smiled. Happy birthday. It's funny how the mind, after all these years, still knows exactly how to rewind, not like a clean, straight line, but more like a warped VHS tape left in the sun too long, where some parts come in sharp and unforgiving, while others flicker at the edges, distorted by the heat of what you tried to bury. I remember the night it started, not because it was dramatic or cinematic, but because it was so ordinary, so goddamn routine, that I didn't even recognize it for what it was until much later. I was 15, still wearing braces, still getting my period irregularly, still trying to pretend I liked the way my jeans looked even though I hated my body and everything in it. Uncle Daniel had always been around, the way uncles are, hovering just enough to be familiar, but not enough to ever truly be part of your daily life. He was the one who bought Lydia a pony when she was 10, the one who wrote checks to cover Grandma's property taxes with a self-satisfied grin, the one who called me kiddo and smelled like cigars and too much aftershave. That night, I was upstairs in Grandma's house, staying over because my mom had some weekend retreat with her church group and didn't want to leave me alone. Grandma offered to keep me for the weekend, said I could sleep in the guest room, watch cable, and help her make cinnamon rolls in the morning. I said yes, because what else was I going to do? He came upstairs after everyone had gone to bed, said he needed to grab a phone charger from the hall closet. I was sitting on the floor of the guest room, cross-legged, flipping through one of Lydia's old magazines, even though I couldn't care less about hair masks or whatever garbage they were selling to girls who already looked like models. He knocked on the doorframe, no door, just one of those open archways with a curtain you could pull closed if you wanted, which I hadn't. He said, "Hey, you up?" like it was nothing. And then he came in. The rest of that memory is fragmented. What I remember clearest isn't what he did, not in detail, but the sound of my own heart in my ears, and how cold I felt afterward. I remember pulling the blanket up around me and trying not to cry because I didn't want Grandma to hear, didn't want her to come up and ask what was wrong, didn't want anyone to look at me like I was broken. I didn't tell her that night. I didn't tell anyone for 3 weeks. But when I finally told Grandma, it wasn't some soap opera scene, no yelling or shaking hands, no dramatic, how dare he. I came to her while she was trimming her rose bushes, wearing gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed hat like she was starring in a southern drama. I said his name, said what he'd done, said I didn't feel safe. She didn't stop pruning. She just turned slightly, looked at me over her sunglasses, and said with a sigh, "Sarah, honey, you must never say that again." That was it. That was her grand maternal intervention. No questions. No concern. Just that slow shake of the head and a half-hearted pat on my shoulder, followed by a warning. Do you understand what it would do to this family? To your mother? To Lydia? To me? And I, being 15, being scared and already doubting myself because he'd been so casual about it, nodded like a goddamn idiot. I nodded and said okay, and I carried that silence like a second skin from that day forward. The thing is, once you're taught to shut your mouth for the sake of the family, you start to believe the lie they're telling you, that protecting the system is more important than protecting yourself. I went off to college and didn't come back for breaks. I stopped returning phone calls. I ignored invitations. They spun the narrative to suit them, told everyone I was rebellious, that I always had a dramatic streak, that I was jealous of Lydia's success or ashamed of how I turned out. No one questioned it because Lydia was their show pony and I was the one who refused to trot. But what they never understood was that I wasn't trying to escape the family, I was trying to survive it. And now here we were, back in the present, the air in the room thick as fog, Lydia holding the papers like they were on fire, Uncle Daniel looking pale and uncomfortable in a way that, to me, read as guilt, though maybe it was just fear. Grandma, seated in her place of honor, looked straight at me, her expression carefully neutral, as if hoping silence might work its old magic one more time. It didn't. Lydia's voice, when it finally came, was brittle and thin, the way glass sounds right before it shatters. "This is a joke, right?" she asked, her eyes flitting from me to the paperwork. "You're not seriously doing this?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The court date was printed in plain black ink. The complaint spelled it all out: the assault, the inaction, the complicity. A civil suit, not criminal, too much time had passed for that, but with enough documentation and testimony to cause a reckoning that no amount of money or elegance could dress up. "What kind of stunt is this, Sarah?" Uncle Daniel barked, his voice louder than I'd heard it in years, the kind of volume meant to intimidate, to reset the power dynamic. "You know damn well this is slander." "No, Daniel," I said slowly, clearly, deliberately, my voice steady even as my heart pounded like it was trying to break out of my ribs. "This is what happens when you bury something alive and it digs its way out." The room stayed silent, stunned. My mother looked like she was about to faint. Lydia was still clutching the envelope like it might turn to ash in her hands. And Grandma, well, she didn't blink. She just lifted her wine glass, took a sip, and said, "I told you to let the past be the past." I looked right at her, that woman who once held my hand during thunderstorms and taught me how to bake snickerdoodles, and I realized how far gone she really was, not because of her age, but because of how little she ever saw me. "And I told you," I replied quietly, "what he did to me. And you told me to shut up. So now? I'm making sure the whole damn world hears me." But before I could leave the room, before I could walk away from the wreckage I had lit like a slow-burning fuse, Lydia stepped forward, her face pale and unreadable, her voice softer than it had been all evening. "I saw something once," she whispered, almost to herself. "Back then. I didn't know what it meant. I thought maybe you were exaggerating, or maybe I didn't want to believe it." She looked up at me, eyes wide, her perfect composure starting to crack just at the edges. "I'm not the bad guy here, Sarah." I stared at her for a moment, then shrugged, not out of indifference, but because some part of me genuinely didn't know anymore. I was no longer certain who was a villain, who was just weak, and who was collateral. "Then who is?" I asked. And Lydia didn't answer. Because maybe she didn't know either. Or maybe she just didn't want to say it out loud. Not yet. Not in front of Grandma. There's a particular silence that takes over a room when something sacred has been broken, not the quiet of peace or understanding, but the tense, vibrating kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel like trespassing. That was the kind of silence hanging in the air after Lydia opened that envelope, after the words "civil suit" left her lips and dropped into the room like a brick through glass. The performance had ended, the party's smiles were suspended in time, and all the carefully constructed roles, dutiful daughter, golden granddaughter, respectable patriarch, benevolent matriarch, had begun to peel and fall away like old wallpaper. It was surreal, almost theatrical, to see it unravel in real time, but it wasn't satisfying yet. Not even close. Because beneath all of that surface-level tension, I could see it in their eyes. The disbelief, the denial, the desperate hope that this was just some emotional outburst that could be contained, dismissed, or smothered into silence. Again. Uncle Daniel, ever the polished professional in his tailored blazer and Italian shoes, stood there with his mouth slightly open, as though the words forming in his throat couldn't quite decide whether they should defend, deflect, or attack. His face had taken on a slight grayness. Not from guilt, I wasn't foolish enough to expect that, but from calculation. He was trying to assess the threat, measure its weight, and plot a response before anyone else had time to fully comprehend the damage. And Lydia, dear, always composed Lydia, had frozen in place, still holding the papers like they were some ancient relic that might burn her fingers if she dared to grip it too tightly. When she finally did speak, her voice was flat, stripped of its usual charm, like someone trying to recite a script in a language they no longer believed in. This can't be real," she muttered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. But I heard her. And I watched her eyes flicker, not just with fear, but with something dangerously close to recognition. I stepped closer, not to threaten, not to gloat, but because I needed to look her in the eye and know for certain whether she was just another pawn in this family's long, ugly game, or something else entirely. It's real, I said calmly, and despite the chaos I'd just unleashed, my voice was the most grounded thing in that room. Filed, signed, served. You might want to read the second page. It lists the dates. She hesitated, then flipped the paper over with stiff, deliberate movements, scanning the typed lines with a tight jaw and a distant stare. Her brow furrowed, her hand clenched, and for a brief second, her posture shifted, not much, but enough for me to catch it. A falter. A wait. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't surprise. It was memory. Lydia had always been careful, always composed, always clean and polished, and just a little too perfect, the kind of person who knew how to orchestrate her life into neat, photographable moments. But in that moment, the mask slipped, and I saw something real, not guilt, not exactly, but complicity born of convenience. That look in her eyes said more than any words ever could. She hadn't known everything, no. But she had known something. And she had chosen silence. Uncle Daniel's voice finally cut through the air like a blade dulled by arrogance. "This is extortion," he snapped, stepping toward me, his hands clenched at his sides, not in violence, but in the way men do when their control is slipping and they have nothing left but performance. "You've got no proof, Sarah. Just old stories and bitter fantasies. This won't hold up in court. You know that." I smiled, not the smug kind, not the vengeful kind, but the kind that comes when a person has lived through the fire and stopped being afraid of getting burned again. "You'd be amazed at what survives," I replied. "Memory, testimony, paper trails, old journals. And silence? It rots things, sure. But sometimes it preserves them too." His eyes narrowed, and I could see the fear finally cracking through the veneer. Not fear of guilt. People like him don't fear guilt. They fear exposure, the loss of narrative, the crumbling of the myths they've built around themselves. And Daniel had built a myth of success, respectability, integrity, a man who hosted charity dinners and donated to scholarships and took his daughter on ski trips every winter. What would the country club say if they found out? What would his clients think? "Why no?" Lydia asked suddenly, her voice more steady, her eyes pinned to mine with something sharper than concern, curiosity. "Why now, after all this time?" I tilted my head slightly, considering the question, because it wasn't one I hadn't asked myself 100 times. Why not 10 years ago? Why not the day I turned 18? Why now, when the years had turned my rage into something quieter, more focused, more surgical? "Because it never stopped," I said, letting the words hang between us. Not in my head. Not in my body. Not in the relationships I couldn't keep. Not in the nights I still wake up with that fucking smell in my nose. Because time didn't heal it. It just gave me space to sharpen it. Lydia's face changed at that, not softened, exactly, but shifted, like something inside her was trying to process a truth she'd spent her whole life avoiding. She looked down at the paper again, her thumb running over the text as if trying to erase it with friction. "I don't know what I saw," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I was young. I didn't want to believe it." "You don't have to," I said. "But now you'll have to say it. Out loud. In court. Under oath." For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Even the walls seemed to lean in, listening, absorbing the weight of what was finally being spoken after so many years of tightly guarded silence. My mother hadn't moved. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, her eyes wide and wet, her hands twisted in her lap like she was trying to hold on to something invisible. And Grandma, ever the queen in her silk and pearls, hadn't said a word in nearly 5 minutes, which for her was a kind of death. Finally, she stood. Slow, deliberate, with the kind of theatrical grace she always performed when she wanted people to pay attention. She walked over to me, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could smell the faint scent of her lavender powder and the bitterness in her breath. "You're going to destroy this family," she said, her voice trembling at the edges, not from emotion, but from the effort of control. "No," I said, meeting her gaze without blinking. "This family was already broken. I'm just done pretending it wasn't." And with that, the performance ended. The curtain dropped. The cracks in Lydia's smile were no longer cracks, they were fractures, wide enough now for everyone to see. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep or physical labor, but from the weight of years spent biting your tongue, pretending to forget what never gave you peace to begin with, and convincing yourself that silence was the smarter path. The safer one, the only way to survive without tearing down everything around you, including the people you once loved. That was the kind of heaviness I carried on my shoulders as I stepped out onto the back patio, needing air, space, distance from the carefully curated disaster unfolding inside my grandmother's house, where the furniture had never moved. But the people had become strangers in their own narratives, unsure of who was supposed to be the villain now that someone finally turned on the lights. I stood there, wrapped in the cool air of early spring, the scent of over-fertilized flower beds lingering beneath the smell of roasted meat and tension that had seeped into the walls. The voices inside had lowered, but hadn't stopped, a muffled chorus of damage control, pride, and denial, all trying to make sense of the bomb I had detonated in the middle of Grandma Evelyn's precious celebration. I had done what no one ever dared to do. I opened the wound. And like a rot beneath polished wood, the infection began to rise, visible now, undeniable, and impossible to sweep away with a prayer or a perfectly worded toast. My mother found me there, as I expected she would, because no matter how far she tried to distance herself from discomfort, she could never resist the compulsion to smooth things over, to fix what she didn't understand, even if it meant denying its existence entirely. She stepped out onto the patio slowly, clutching her sweater around her shoulders as if the air itself were conspiring against her, her eyes glassy with the kind of sadness that only comes from having run out of justifications. For a long moment, she didn't speak, just stood beside me in that awkward, sideways stance she always used when she was unsure whether to hug me or scold me. When she finally did open her mouth, her voice was thin, barely audible over the hum of the outdoor light. "I didn't know what to say," she whispered, like she'd been practicing the line for years. I turned to her, not cruelly, not even with anger, but with the weary calm of someone who had accepted long ago that there would never be an apology clean enough to erase the silence that had followed what I told her all those years ago. I didn't interrupt. I let her talk, because she needed to, and because I needed to hear it. "I knew something was wrong back then," she continued, her voice thickening, cracking, dragging each word behind it like a weight. "You changed. You stopped talking, stopped laughing, you didn't look me in the eye anymore. I tried to ask, but when your grandmother said she'd spoken to you and that it was taken care of, I believed her. I thought maybe it was just a phase, something hormonal, maybe even something with school. And then you went away and you didn't come back." I folded my arms and looked out across the yard, remembering the afternoons I spent playing there as a child, long before I understood how families could look like sanctuaries and feel like traps. "She didn't speak to me," I said after a pause, and the words were heavier than I'd expected. "She warned me. She told me to shut up. Told me not to embarrass the family." My mother's face crumpled, not into tears, not at first, but into something harder to witness. Guilt wrapped in helplessness, the kind of expression people wear when they know they've failed, not just in the past, but repeatedly, and there's no making it right. She sat down on one of the wrought iron chairs, pressing her fingers against her temples like she could massage the years away. "I was scared of her," she said quietly, her voice more fragile now, less defensive. "I always have been." She controlled everything: money, decisions, reputations. She could lift you up or crush you in front of your own children and make it look like love. I begged her to help when your father left, and she did, but it came with strings I never untangled. When she said you were fine, that she handled it, I let myself believe her. Because I couldn't afford not to. I stood there for a moment, letting the words settle, tasting the sourness of them on my tongue. "Handled it," I repeated, almost to myself, with a bitter laugh. That's what she called it. Burying a trauma and protecting the man who caused it. Handling it. My mother looked up at me then, and this time the tears were there, clinging to the edges of her eyes, but refusing to fall. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words late, inadequate, but sincere. I know, I said, and I meant it, but it didn't change anything. Because sorry doesn't unring bells. It doesn't unmake scars or erase the silence that stretched between us for 2 decades. Inside, the storm was still brewing. Lydia was on her phone now, pacing like a caged animal, probably calling her lawyer or Googling civil procedure, while Uncle Daniel sat with clenched fists and vacant eyes, his mind calculating the potential fallout. But it wasn't him who came to me next. It was Lydia. She stepped outside with a strange expression on her face, less rage, more confusion, like someone who had finally realized the floor beneath them was not as solid as they'd believed. She looked at me, not with contempt, but with something far more uncomfortable, uncertainty. "I've been thinking," she said, and even that phrase, simple as it was, felt like a seismic shift coming from her. "You said I might be called to testify." I nodded. "You were there. You saw things. You knew something wasn't right." "I wasn't sure," she admitted. "I was 13. I saw him come out of your room late one night. I saw you crying the next morning. I asked Grandma about it. She told me to mind my business." "And you did," I said, not harshly, but not gently either. "You minded it for 25 years. She looked down, then back at me, and for the first time, I saw her without the filter of family narrative. She was still Lydia, elegant, refined, the pride of our grandmother, but now I saw the little girl she once was, confused and scared, pushed into silence just like I had been. The difference was I had broken, and she had folded. "I'm not him," she said suddenly. "I'm not Grandma. I want to do the right thing, even if it's late." I didn't say anything, because some truths don't need immediate reactions. Some truths are like seeds, and this one had just been planted. Whether it would grow, I couldn't say yet. But I did tell her this: late is better than never. But don't pretend it comes without cost. And she nodded quietly, like someone who understood exactly what kind of price that meant. We stood there in silence for a moment, me, my cousin, and the mother who had failed to protect me, surrounded by the ruins of a party that was never meant to celebrate anything but illusion. The wind picked up. The door creaked open again. And this time, it was Grandma. Her expression was unreadable, but her posture was stiff, her voice flat and cold. "I want to speak to you alone," she said, directing it at me with the imperious tone she reserved for commands disguised as invitations. I followed her inside, not because I owed her anything, but because I wanted to see what she looked like when power started to slip through her fingers like dust. She led me into the sitting room, the one with the heavy curtains and the glass-covered coffee table where she used to serve brandy and gossip about neighbors who divorced too publicly. She sat down carefully, folded her hands, and looked at me without blinking. "Let's be reasonable," she began. "We don't need to make this ugly. I can offer you something, a settlement. Quiet, respectful, dignified. Let's protect the family, Sarah." I stared at her, stunned not by the offer itself, but by the fact that even now, she still thought this was about money, about leverage, about appearance. "You don't get it," I said, leaning forward. "This isn't about a payout. It's about truth. It's about consequences. It's about the 15-year-old girl you told to shut her mouth so a predator could keep his seat at the head of the table." Her lips thinned, but she didn't look away. "Be careful," she said softly, like a threat wrapped in grandmotherly concern. "Revenge is a bitter thing." "This isn't revenge," I said. "It's justice. And it's overdue." And with that, I stood, leaving her in her perfectly decorated room full of lies and porcelain, the queen of a crumbling empire she built on silence, fear, and appearances. And for the first time in 20 years, I walked away not as the victim, not as the outcast, but as the one finally speaking. There's something strange about how quiet the truth is once it's been spoken aloud, how it doesn't echo through the halls or crash through the ceiling, how it just settles there, heavy and unmovable. Like a piece of old furniture no one wants to claim, but everyone keeps walking around. In the days that followed Grandma Evelyn's birthday party, if you could even call that train wreck a party, there were no phone calls, no check-ins, no apologies, no long-winded emails trying to explain it all away. There was just silence, cold and deliberate, the kind that doesn't leave room for misunderstanding. The family, or what was left of it, had closed ranks around its shame, and I had been carved out cleanly like a tumor removed to stop the spread, except the cancer hadn't been me, and we both knew it. Word got out, of course, as it always does, especially in circles where image is currency and gossip is a form of social currency with interest. The lawsuit, once filed, was public record, and even though I hadn't gone to the press, I'd spoken to a local reporter I trusted, someone who'd once written about survivors and knew how to handle stories like mine with care and precision. I didn't do it for spectacle, but for light, because some things fester in the dark, and I'd been sick of the stench for far too long. The article dropped 3 days after the party, just a small feature tucked into the human interest section online, but it spread quickly, quietly at first, like a whisper, then faster, like a brush fire on dry land. Lydia stopped posting about her yoga retreats and brand partnerships for a while, and when she returned, her feed was rebranded muted tones, filtered scripture quotes about grace and forgiveness, cryptic captions like, "Healing is messy," and "When your soul is louder than the noise." I didn't comment. I didn't like or share. I just watched, quietly, from the sidelines, recognizing the curated language of someone trying to rewrite their role in a story they didn't write but never stopped benefiting from. To her credit, she never denied what happened, not in public, not in private either. She didn't apologize exactly, but she showed up to her deposition, told the truth as she remembered it, and answered every question without flinching. For that, I was grateful, even if part of me still resented the decades she spent in willful ignorance while I unraveled alone. Uncle Daniel, on the other hand, hired a lawyer within 48 hours, a man with slick hair and a voice like polished steel, who filed a response denying everything, accusing me of fabricating memories and seeking financial gain. I expected it. Men like Daniel don't confess, they deflect, distract, discredit. The man who once winked at me across dinner tables and handed me 20s with a grin was now trying to convince the world I was a manipulative, unstable liar. And even that didn't hurt as much as it should have. I'd already mourned the truth long ago, now I was simply documenting it. Grandma, predictably, said nothing publicly. There were whispers, of course, in her church group, among her neighbors, in the narrow, polished halls of the retirement community she refused to move into because those places smell like waiting rooms for death. Her silence wasn't born of ignorance, it was tactical. She thought silence was power. But in the absence of words, people filled in the blanks for her, and for once, she couldn't control the narrative. She tried, I'm sure, behind closed doors and closed blinds, likely blaming me, calling me ungrateful, dramatic, emotionally unstable, whatever made her feel less complicit in the very thing she helped conceal. But power, when built on denial, always begins to slip, and Evelyn knew it. The pearls she wore like armor, the makeup she applied like war paint, none of it could shield her now. At the pretrial hearing, I sat in the hallway of the courthouse, a nondescript building with flickering lights and cold tile floors, feeling like I was waiting for something I couldn't name. My attorney, Mark, a man who'd known me since I was 19 and had quietly believed me from the beginning, offered me a nod of reassurance. I didn't need it, not really, I wasn't scared anymore. Not of Daniel. Not of Evelyn. Not of what the world might say if I dared to say this out loud in a room full of strangers. But I did appreciate the gesture, because it reminded me that not everyone turned away. Some people stayed. Some people listened. Lydia arrived a few minutes later, walking past me without a word, dressed in gray slacks and a muted blouse, not a pearl in sight. She looked tired. I wondered, briefly, if she felt it too, that weight, that consequence. I didn't hate her. I didn't even envy her. But I saw her now, stripped of all the polish and praise, and I wondered what might have been different if she'd spoken up sooner, if we'd faced this together, instead of on opposite ends of the same lie. Daniel came last, flanked by his lawyer, his expression as blank as stone. He didn't look at me. Not once. And I was grateful for that, because I didn't need him to. I didn't need an apology or acknowledgement, or some last-minute moment of honesty that would do nothing to return the girl I was or the years I'd lost. I didn't need him to look at me to know what he'd done. The judge called the case number and we filed in. The room was quiet, clinical, full of process and paperwork, but it pulsed with something deeper, the knowledge that what was once whispered, denied, hidden beneath Sunday dresses and family dinners, was now being recorded, official, witnessed. I didn't tremble when I took the stand. I didn't cry when I answered their questions. I didn't look at anyone but the court reporter, because she was the one writing it all down, and for the first time, I wanted my words carved into record, not memory. After it was over, as people shuffled out, I stayed in my seat for just a moment longer. The courtroom had emptied except for Mark, who waited by the door, giving me space. I sat there, hands folded, back straight, breathing slow and deep, letting it wash over me, not peace, not relief, not yet, but something that felt like the beginning of an after. Not closure, because closure is a myth we tell ourselves to make endings feel clean, but continuation, movement, forward momentum. As I stepped outside, the sun hit my face in that sharp, honest way it only does after rain. The street was noisy, the world unaware that something inside me had shifted, finally and permanently. I didn't know what came next, whether Daniel would settle or fight, whether Grandma would disown me officially, whether Lydia would return to her perfect life or unravel completely. I didn't even know if I'd feel any better in 6 months or 6 years. But I did know this. When people talk about courage, they often imagine something loud, defiant, cinematic. What they don't tell you is that sometimes courage looks like speaking the truth when your voice shakes, telling your story when no one claps, and standing in the middle of your own fire and refusing to be burned again. You asked me once why I never come home, Grandma. Now you know. And I'm not sorry.